So as Lori so kindly said, my name is Kylie Smith. And before we get into today's lecture, I just want to give you a little bit of a story about how I became interested in nutrition because it's really relevant to the topic of today. As she said, my initial degree was in physiology. And at the time, I was thinking about going into physical therapy. And we have to take a class that I needed to apply to PT school that was on diet and exercise. But I was really more intrigued by the diet portion of the class than the exercise. And it was actually a lecture on how dietary fats affect heart health that really moved me into the field of nutrition. And I've really all since then have called myself a jack of all trades dietitian, but I've held really every position in the medical field that a dietitian can hold, including 15 years as an oncology dietitian and going on 18 years as a diabetes educator. But my very first job was actually as a dietitian at the lipid clinic up at OHSU in Portland, Oregon. And since then, I've been really honing in on critical care. I've been doing that for the last 10 years, and I really love being able to solve those medical puzzles and with nutrition therapy. And also teaching at DVC has just been a wonderful experience because I kind of find students to be a little more eager to learn about nutrition than people in hospital beds. But let's dig into the lecture, about fats, the good, the bad, and the pretty tasty details. So I plan to answer these burning questions that you probably have, which is, do I really need fat in my diet? And what's the difference between the types of fat found in our blood? What's the difference between the types of fat found in our diets? Which fats are the ones that contribute to poor health outcomes? And is coconut oil a healthful alternative to butter? And what kind of diet should I eat? So we can classify nutrients in two main ways when we're talking about nutrition. And there are macronutrients, which are the nutrients that we need large amounts of every day. They provide us with calories. These include proteins, fats, also known as lipids, carbohydrates, which include both starches and sugars. And there are micronutrients like vitamins, minerals, phytochemicals, which are just chemicals found in plants that provide some known health benefits, as well as antioxidants. And we actually classify water as a micronutrient because it doesn't provide our bodies with calories like proteins, fats, and carbohydrates do. And even though I could talk about nutrition all day, let's kind of focus in on fats and lipids for right now. So what is the purpose of having fats in our diet? Well, for one, fats make our food taste good. And similarly, they also make our food have a better texture by improving the tenderness and the softness of the food. And because the food is more tender and it makes the food taste good, that really improves our satisfaction in eating the foods that have fats in them. Many of you may recall a cookie company called Snackwell, and this was the food industry's answer to providing a low-fat cookie in the 1990s during that kind of craze that we went through. And if you've ever had one of these cookies, it doesn't really matter what flavor, you would eat the recommended serving size and you would be left so unsatisfied that you'd just keep eating more and more until you had the whole box. And that's because it's lacking fat. And fat, they take longer to digest. They kind of sit in our stomach longer. So they fill you up and they make you feel as if you've had enough. So these low-fat foods were not a really good solution. They definitely didn't make people feel satisfied at all. Excess calories are what led to weight gain, and people were following these low-fat diets were probably over-consuming the calories from these kinds of foods, and it led to overconsumption. On more of a structural side, we definitely need some types of fat for survival. And there are essential fats that our bodies need. We need to get that from our diet in order to thrive. And lastly, we have to have some fats to absorb those fat-soluble vitamins. So fats have been recently a lesser appreciated macronutrient. It was the devil in the 1990s, like I said. But we've learned so much more since then, and we can better understand what kinds of fats are beneficial and those that are more harmful. However, nutrition is a real young science, and it's younger than genetics even. So let's face it, humans are pretty unreliable subjects, and that makes it hard to get consistent results. So when we're testing about all the things that involve lipids and fats, it is changing, and it's changing quite rapidly. But something that we're really solid knowledge on, fats, they're calorie dense. They provide 9 calories per gram. And we also have those essential fats that we need in our diet. There's alpha linolenic acid, which is the omega-3 fat, and linoleic acid, which is the omega-6 fat. And our bodies are going to digest these dietary fats into fatty acids, which we're going to use to make hormones and the structural component of cell membranes. And so here I've got an illustration of what the cell membranes look like. And you can see that we use 2 layers of what's called a phospholipid to make up the membrane. You have the water-loving part of the phospholipid that faces outward toward the blood and inside toward the cells. And those are represented by the little red balls. That's a protein layer. It's not the lipid at all. The lipid part is actually these little yellow tails that you see in the center. That's called a fatty acid tail. Now we also need, like I said, those fats to absorb vitamins A, D, E, and K. And so if you're someone who likes to take their vitamin D supplement with your morning coffee or a glass of orange juice, I'm really going to suggest you start taking it at night with your dinner. And that's because it will help with the absorption of the vitamin D, since most of us eat a little fat with our dinner. Now, there are also non-essential fats that we can use in our diet to make other kinds of fats that we need. We also use fat as an energy source. So we use fat for energy when we're resting. That means like we're not really exercising, or when we're doing low intensity activity. And that's kind of the basis for that zone 2 diet or activity, excuse me, that you might have been hearing so much about recently. In our diets, there are 2 types of fats. One is called saturated fat. I'm going to get a little sciencey here for a second, so bear with me. The fats that have all of their carbon atoms, like you can see here on this chain, if they're all taken up by hydrogen, they're saturated with hydrogen molecules. If they're unsaturated, they have some carbon atoms that don't have hydrogen attached, and then they get a double bond like you see right here on the bottom. This means that carbon atoms that form this double bond are going to make the structure a little more liquidy, and I'll talk about that in a second. So if you have one double bond, we call that a monounsaturated or one unsaturated fat. And if you have more than one of these double bonds, this is called a poly or mini unsaturated fat. So saturated fats are going to look like this. Remember, if we were to look at that chemical structure of the fatty acids, saturated fats have only one single bond on the fatty acid tail because they're entirely saturated with hydrogen atoms. And here you can see a diagram of the chemical nature of a saturated fat. This long chain on the left side of the molecule represents the carbon of the fatty acid tail. And you can see there's only like one line that attaches one to the next. Then all of the open spaces of the carbon are taken up with hydrogen. This type of structure is what makes saturated fats solid at room temperature. And we often say that if the fat is hard at room temperature, then it's hard on our arteries. The dietary guidelines for Americans recommends no more than 10% of your calories coming from saturated fats per day. Saturated fats are found in tropical oils, high-fat dairy products, and also animal meats. When you look at a steak and you admire that marbling between the meat fibers, that's saturated fat. Little short story here. Many years ago, when my husband and I were living in Portland, Oregon, we went to a nice restaurant. And my husband saw there was something called Kobe beef on the menu. And this was many years ago. We didn't really know much about it. He called the waiter over, who was very happy to tell him, oh yeah, Kobe beef is very, very lean. It's a very lean meat. It starts off really fatty, and then all the fat melts away and it leaves the fat very lean. And so after the waiter left, I told my husband, there's no way that's true. Fat doesn't really disappear. He could still order it if he wanted, but he just need to know that it was not going to be as lean of a meat as the guy promised. And just to show you what this means, like the USDA will define a lean cut of meat as having no more than 10 grams of total fat and no more than 4.5 grams of saturated fat in a 3.5 ounce portion. So by comparison, A 3.5 ounce portion of Kobe beef has 28 grams of total fat, 11 grams of saturated fat. And some of it will cook away, but actually a good portion of fat is bound in what's called fibrous fat of meat, and it's retained when you consume it. So that's how you're able to get a lot of saturated fat when you eat meat products. If you prefer to eat a vegetarian or a plant-based diet, you might be thinking that the coconut oil is fine since it doesn't come from animals. But our bodies don't really know the difference between the saturated fats from animals or plants. And research has been shown to indicate that coconut and palm oils do raise bad cholesterol. Moreover, we have plenty of research indicating the health benefits of fish and plant oils that have not been demonstrated in reliable research on coconut oils. So even though we know that saturated fats are known to increase the bad or LDL cholesterol, the exact link is debated since the whole food component comes into play here and seems to alter that effect of the LDL for certain foods. It's not really well understood. And moreover, genetics may play a stronger link into how your body will use saturated fats to make LDL. So this link is as clear as mud, as researchers say. The other type of fat is called an unsaturated fat. And unlike saturated fats, the fatty acid tail will only have one double bond, at least one double bond. When there's only one double bond present, this is called a monounsaturated fat. And these fats are liquid at room temperature. You can find monounsaturated fat in plants like nuts, olive oil, avocados, and canola oil. These kinds of oils can help lower the bad or the LDL cholesterol and raise the good or HDL cholesterol. If the unsaturated fat has more than one double bond in its chemical structure, we call this a polyunsaturated fat. And like monounsaturated fats, they are liquid at room temperature. However, polyunsaturated fats contain the class of essential fats that we need to obtain from our diet to survive. So there are two types of essential fats. There's the alpha-linolenic or omega-3 fat and linoleic or omega-6 fat. Essential fats include these omega-3 and omega-6, and they're named this way. I only bring this up because somebody asked me this question in a class once. Why are they called omega-6 and omega-3? Well, it's because of how many atoms away the double bond is from that terminal methyl group in their chemical structure. So as you see here in this picture, omega-3s are 3 carbons away. And if it's an omega-6, it's 6 carbons away. There's also an omega-9, as you can see there, which we're not going to talk about today. Omega-3 fats are anti-inflammatory, and you might see them as DHA, EPA, or a plant-based version called ALA. And the RDA for omega-3s is actually only based on ALA, since our bodies can convert ALA to both EPA and DHA. However, this process is really inefficient, which is why they do a lot more studies on EPA and DHA. Vegetarians should aim for higher amounts of ALA, like the kind found in walnuts and flax seeds, or consume seaweed, which is another great source of EPA. Flax seeds, chia seeds, nuts, and fish, as well as plant oils like canola, avocado, and olive, are all good sources of omega-3 fats. These oils should be stored in dark containers away from heat and light to preserve them from going rancid. And similarly, you should also avoid using these oils for frying since it will degrade the omega-3 fat and potentially even cause trans fat to develop. Of these 3, avocado has the highest smoke point, which is the temperature at which you can heat an oil before it starts to create smoke. And then the next highest smoke points are peanut, sunflower, and then canola oil, and then olive oil. Butter and nut oils have a pretty low smoke point, so you don't want to use them for high heat cooking. They're going to create a bigger mess if you cook with them. Can't have a conversation about fats without talking about trans fats. Now, trans fats were the commercial food industry's answer to reduce lard and saturated fat in the diet. They started making these around the 1970s. They were made by taking liquid oil and pumping it full of hydrogen to make it solid, kind of like saturating the fat, right? But unfortunately, in doing so, they made these oils even more atherogenic, meaning bad for the heart, than saturated fats were. If you look at an ingredient label, you'll see them listed as a partially hydrogenated fat. And you have to be careful here because it's not the same as a fully hydrogenated fat. Those fully hydrogenated fats are not as inflammatory as the partially hydrogenated ones, even though they're still not really considered a healthy oil. Like Crisco is an example of a fully hydrogenated oil. You can still find these oils in many processed foods, and they are high in added sugar and salt. They don't have any benefit for heart health, but they don't seem to have any detrimental effect either. Trans fats are highly inflammatory, and they were banned from the US foods in 2015, but companies had until 2018 to comply, and that was extended again until 2021. It's important to point out the ban only refers to commercially made trans fats, and it does not, it's not applicable to naturally occurring trans fats like CLA or conjugated linoleic acid, which hasn't really been studied well for its health effects. The animal studies have suggested that CLA can be useful in aiding in weight loss and fighting cancer, but it just hasn't been produced yet. So when we take this unsaturated fatty acid, this liquid oil, and it has at least one double bond in it, and then we hydrogenate it, we add all that hydrogen to it, we turn it basically into a saturated fatty acid. And we'll turn a normally liquid oil into one that's solid. The difference here between a saturated and a trans fat is the configuration of that molecule. Fully hydrogenated fats will have all of their double bonds change to single bonds, but it's really, like I said, those partially hydrogenated fats that are the problem. This transformation is a chemical term that means that the hydrogen atoms are on the opposite sides of one another of a double bond. If they're cis, that's CIS, it refers to when the hydrogen atoms are on the same side of a double bond. And so that's not a harmful configuration. Fully hydrogenated fats will not have this trans bond, they'll have the cis bond. And the trans fats are going to have that configuration of, and those are going to be made up with the partially hydrogenated oils that you need to avoid. So saturated fats are solid at room temperature, and we can find them in meat and full-fat dairy products, as well as tropical oils like coconut and palm. Palm oils are commonly used in candy bars, so they can also be hidden in baked and processed foods. And if you read descriptions of these foods, they'll be creamy or buttery or crispy, velvety, rich, flaky, or prime. Unsaturated fats are the healthiest, and we have the polyunsaturated fats that provide us with the essential fats we need to survive. You can get them from fish and nuts and plant oils. And monounsaturated fats are helpful to lower that LDL and raise that HDL cholesterol, and you can find them in plant sources like nuts, seeds, and avocados. Just remember that foods that are good sources of fat are often calorie rich. And if you're trying to manage your weight, even healthy fats can put someone over their calorie budget and sabotage weight loss. So trans fats have mostly been banned, but you can still find them in anything that's fried, battered, or like a shortening or stick margarine, or commercially baked cakes, pies, and cookies, and refrigerated dough. It's because hidden trans fats can still exist when restaurants are using heated oils near their smoke point. And these heated oils have been hot for many hours at a time. This is going to increase the chances of hydrogen getting into the oil, and that your French fries and fried chicken is going to have some undeclared trans fats in them. If you have any foods in your pantry from 2021 or prior, and I really hope you don't, they could still contain trans fats. So it's important to point out that the ban only refers to those manufactured trans fats and not the ones that can be created in kitchens or the ones that are naturally occurring, like that conjugated linoleic acid I mentioned earlier. These naturally occurring trans fats just don't seem to have the negative health implication that the manufactured trans fats have. It may come as a surprise that even some healthy oils have some saturated fats in them. So olive oil, for instance, is not 100% omega-3 and omega-6 fat. It has a little bit of saturated fat in there too, and some of that omega-9 that I mentioned earlier. Here you can see a distribution in oils by their saturated fat, polyunsaturated fat, and monounsaturated fat content. You can see here, even lard is more than half unsaturated fat, and canola oil still has about 7% saturated fat. Olive oil, which is the one most known for its health benefits, only has about 10% of its polyunsaturated fat, which is lower than the 32% found in canola oil. And the most prominent oil that's in the US diet, actually soybean oil, which is low in saturated fat, but has a really high amount of this omega-6 fat compared to omega-3 fat. So what does this graph tell you? Well, what it should give you the impression of is that you need to be consuming a variety of oils in your diet and consume the ones that are highest in saturated fat in the smallest amounts. We can also use this to decipher the ratio of the omega-6 to omega-3 fats. So Americans are consuming 26 times the amount of omega-6 fat to omega-3 fat, mostly because we get them in processed foods made with soybean, cottonseed, and sunflower oils. And most experts really believe that we should only be getting 2 to 4 times the amount of omega-6 fats to omega-3 in our diet. So when you're selecting cooking oils, be sure you choose ones that are better balanced. The Nutrition Facts Panel is your golden ticket to understanding what is really going on in the food that you purchase. Now, the downside to this is that you need to have a little guidance on what you need to do for your health. So let's take a look here at this Nutrition Facts Panel. And on the panel at the very top, it's important to know how many servings are in a container and how big that serving is supposed to be. So if you were to go to the store and say, grab a bag of chips, take the little small one, not the little teeny tiny ones that you put in your kids' lunches. This is more like the ones that's 2 or 3 ounces. Well, believe it or not, that's 2 or 3 servings in one bag, which means if you eat that entire bag, you're going to be getting 2 to 3 times the calories, the fat, the sodium, the carbs, everything listed on here. So it's always a good starting point to know what the reference would be. The labels now very clearly put calories bolded and in bigger type, and this is consistent with the FDA goals to help manage weight in Americans. So they want you to know where you're getting when you eat them. Under those are the macronutrients and their components, as well as sodium. Other nutrients at the bottom required to be listed if they're present are vitamin D, calcium, and iron, because Americans are notoriously low in all of these, as well as potassium, usually for those who have kidney issues. Now, how can you use this to help manage dietary fat? Well, if you look on the right-hand side of the panel, you see these percentages. These are the daily values. And I like to use them to help people stay within the dietary guidelines for Americans, which is to be less than 10%. So if you eat a food that has less than 10% of saturated fat in it, and you eat all your foods to have a label showing less than 10% of saturated fat in it, you're going to meet this goal. You can also look and see how much trans fat is in the food. Now, trans fats were important to list on the foods because we know they're worse for heart health than saturated fats. And those artificial trans fats, those are the partially hydrogenated ones, have been banned, but they can still be found in small amounts if they have less than 0.5 grams per serving or if they're naturally occurring. So this could still be a problem if you eat more than that recommended serving size, because if something has 0.5 grams of trans fat, but you eat 4 servings, well, suddenly you're eating 0.5 grams of trans fat times 4, and that starts to get significant. Okay, so it's time for a pop quiz. I've listed here some oils and fats, and I want you to be able to pick out which ones are heart healthy. And you can choose more than one. I've got canola oil, coconut oil, butter, margarine, olive oil, avocado oil, and Crisco. So which do you think? Well, if you said canola oil, you're right. There's actually a myth about how canola oil is not good for our health, and it may have something to do with those omega-6 fats that are in there. But the amount of omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is the best in canola oil compared to any other oil that's out there. And you should still try and minimize its exposure to higher temperatures when cooking to preserve that profile. But similar to olive oil, I hope you chose avocado oil and olive oil. Both of these are great anti-inflammatory oils. Even though they have a higher ratio of those omega-6 to omega-3 fats, we have a lot of good studies on these being healthy for our heart. So what about margarine? Yeah, that's a really tough one because margarines in the US have to be free of trans fat. So the healthiest ones are going to be a blend of plant oils that are high in unsaturated fats. However, some margarines are going to substitute palm oil or fully hydrogenated oils to make them more firm. So the answer here is choose a soft tub margarine and just check the ingredients for tropical oils and fully hydrogenated fats. Now, what didn't we choose? We didn't choose coconut oil. And coconut oils are a saturated fat, and they really have been shown to improve the HDL cholesterol, which is good. But unfortunately, they also raise that LDL cholesterol. And butter is another saturated fat that has negative consequences to the lipid profile. And then there's Crisco, which uses those fully hydrogenated fats and just doesn't really have any heart health benefit. Okay, I've been talking about these LDL and HDL cholesterols. What are these? What are these health implications of the fats in our bodies? So simplistically, there are two types of cholesterol. There's the LDL cholesterol. That's often called the bad cholesterol. And if you want to remember the L stands for lousy, and we want that number to be low. And the HDL is often referred to as a good cholesterol. H stands for healthy, and we want it to be higher. LDL cholesterol is what our bodies deposit in our arteries. The more LDL is in your blood, the more is likely to be deposited and the narrower your arteries become. HDL cholesterol will act like a garbage truck, and it goes through your blood vessels and it picks up cholesterol, brings it back to the liver where you're going to excrete it in bile. And the next time you have something that is high in soluble fiber, like oatmeal, for instance, it's going to bind up that bile and excrete it out with your poop. And your body says, well, gosh, I need to make more bile. So it sends out more HDL to collect more cholesterol. Over here on the right, you can see a young artery that has normal blood flow. And as it slowly becomes narrower and narrower with LDL cholesterol deposits with time, the blood vessel develops inflammation and blocks blood flow. This causes higher blood pressure and eventually decreases the oxygen to the heart, causing a heart attack, or decreases oxygen to the brain, causing a stroke. So when do we actually start seeing this narrowing? Pretty common to see 50-year-old men coming in. We're starting to see women coming in their 60s, which is a lot sooner than we used to. But we've actually done autopsies on children as young as 6 years of age who've already been showing these cholesterol plaque formations. And it's probably because of a high intake of saturated fat diets, highly processed foods, and fast foods. And when I talk with patients in the hospital after having a heart attack, they'll tell me, gosh, I can't believe I had a heart attack. I changed my diet 2, 5, 10 years before. But unfortunately, if your HDL remains low, remember that garbage truck cholesterol, the plaques can remain stable and still lead to this cardiac event. And so that's why your doctor really places so much emphasis on improving the HDL cholesterol and lowering the LDL cholesterol. It's also important to point out that nutrition is a real slow medicine. And if you've been told you have high cholesterol, that's the work of decades of overconsumption and lifestyle that has contributed to that plaque formation. Another component of our blood lipids is the triglyceride. This is a type of fat that's found in our blood, and it's made up of a glycerol backbone that has 3 fatty acids attached to it. This is how our body packages up fats from digestion and absorption in the small intestine as they're transported into the blood where they can be used for energy. And if you consume an excess of calories that your body doesn't need right away, then those triglycerides get moved to be stored in fat cells. And levels can be up for about 3 to 4 hours after eating and will eventually return to normal levels. They're usually released into the blood when they are being used for energy. And you can see normal levels, anything less than 150 milligrams per deciliter, when taken as a fasting test. If you have a higher number, it may suggest a diet high in saturated fat, processed carbohydrates, alcohol use, or limited physical activity. Wait, are you going to say anything about dietary cholesterol? Okay, dietary cholesterol and blood cholesterol are not the same thing. So if we eat foods that have dietary cholesterol, it doesn't convert to blood cholesterol. The American Heart Association pointed out, and I quote, although dietary cholesterol was once singled out as a contributor to heart disease, the 2019 Science Advisory said studies have not generally supported an association between dietary cholesterol and cardiovascular risk, end quote. However, it's important that we reduce foods that are high in cholesterol because foods high in dietary cholesterol are also found in animal-based foods that tend to be high in saturated fat. So foods like sausages, pastries, red meats, and cheese, they're all high in saturated fat and dietary cholesterol. The only exceptions to this are eggs and shellfish, which, despite being really high in dietary cholesterol, are pretty low in saturated fat, and they've been shown to be healthy as long as they're not cooked fried. Eggs, of course, were once thought of as the thing we had to cut back on when we needed to cut back on dietary cholesterol. Of course, I think now with egg prices, everybody's cutting back on eggs. But they, it was a complicated association because when people ate eggs, they often ate it with high saturated foods like bacon, sausage, and butter. So now we know that you can have eggs as long as you're not having all these other high saturated fat foods, and that can be a part of a heart healthy diet. And sometimes I get asked this question, will eating fat make me fat? Well, the answer is no, but it can be a little bit more complicated. So fat stored in our bodies is called adipose tissue. And where we store our fat makes a big difference to our health. So subcutaneous fat is the fat that's found just under our skin, and it's often predominantly seen in the hips and thighs of women. These don't seem to have the kind of ill health complications that visceral fat does. Now, visceral fat is a type of adipose that we store in our belly cavity, which puts pressure on our internal organs and increases our insulin resistance, blood pressure, and cholesterol. So it does take about 3,500 extra calories over our basal metabolic rate to store 1 pound of fat. And also, if we want to have a deficit of 3,500 calories to lose a pound of fat. And even though we all have individualized metabolisms, if we consume more than our bodies are using, then we're going to store these calories. And if we burn more than we use, we're going to lose those calories. Excessive calories can come from any macronutrient and is stored as adipose tissue in our bodies. Now, we don't actually store alcohol in our bodies, but the way that alcohol makes you develop more adipose tissue is due to that delay in metabolizing fats after consuming an alcoholic beverage. Remember those triglycerides I talked about? Right. So you're gonna package up these extra calories into triglycerides. And if you have alcohol, because it's a toxin, your body's going to spend all of its energy detoxifying this alcohol that isn't metabolizing these fats. And so what happens is that fat is going to get stored as additional weight. So it doesn't matter if you're having pizza, steak and potatoes, or salmon, avocados, and spinach with your beer and wine, the calories from that food is going to get stored as fat instead of being burned for energy. So does that mean that you could eat whatever you want to lose body fat? Well, this is a case study called the Twinkie diet. About 14 years ago, Professor Mark Haub from Kansas State University set out to show that it doesn't matter what you eat, that you can lose weight and improve your blood lipids just by cutting back on calories. And he started on a fast food diet. The professor reduced his calorie intake from a maintenance level of roughly 2,600 calories a day to less than 1,600 calories a day. And he did this for 10 weeks. It ended up being pretty successful. He lost 27 pounds. It's because he had this deficit of 1,000 calories a day. And for 10 weeks, that would be about 70,000 calories that he lost. And if you remember, there's 3,500 calories required to lose 1 pound of body fat. This would be enough for him to lose about 20 pounds of that body fat. So these small calorie deficits to lose other body tissue, like protein, for instance, and doesn't take any energy at all to lose body water. So I think part of this is 20 pounds of body fat and probably 7 pounds of body water, maybe a little bit of muscle too. So what really happened here? It's calorie restriction that produced the professor's weight loss. And as far as the changes that you see here in his lipid panel, because his lipid panel also improved, this is a known effect of weight loss for any type of diet. It doesn't matter if it's a low fat diet, a low carb diet, a keto diet, or even a Twinkie diet. If you lose weight, your blood lipids are going to decrease as well. An excess amount of body fat is associated with higher inflammatory responses and also increased levels of insulin. Insulin is a hormone your body releases into the blood to pull sugar into cells. So if you release more insulin, you're going to pull more nutrients into cells and you're going to store more energy. Both inflammation and some hormonal imbalances affect the cholesterol and other blood lipids. So when you lose that body fat, these effects are reversed and improvements in blood lipids are very likely. However, studies do indicate that when we stop losing weight and we continue on a poor diet that's high in processed carbs, high in saturated fat, our blood lipids are going to start to rise again. So this is clearly not the best way to maintain any form of weight loss. And Professor Haub points that out. He only did this to show you can lose weight by eating a calorie deficit. The mistake here is to think that this means better health. For one thing, health is just a composite of far more than the BMI or your LDL cholesterol. And its relevant time horizon is far more distant than just 2 months. We're looking out for long term here. So what am I supposed to eat? Well, I recommend a diet with variety and one that is sustainable for long term. You now know that there is nothing magical about weight loss other than calories. And you know that if you lose weight, your blood lipids are going to go down. But if you overconsume healthful foods and overeat, it's going to be hard to maintain weight. So you want to maintain good health. You want to focus on foods that are rich in phytonutrients and fiber and plant-based and with lean meats. So what I recommend is a Mediterranean diet. These are the foods that are eaten in countries across the Mediterranean Sea, including Spain, Italy, Greece, Lebanon, Morocco, and the south of France. It's also part of what's called the Blue Zone, which is a region in the world where residents have a longer life expectancy, often beyond the age of 80. And it's thought to be due to a lifestyle combining regular physical activity, low stress levels, socializing, low incidence of chronic illness, and a local whole foods diet. The foods in this region will vary on culture, but they're largely plant-based with whole grains, with nuts, fresh fruits and vegetables, beans, low-fat dairy, seafood, and lean poultry. And there's very little animal meat consumed, so very little saturated fat from animals being consumed. And olive oil is the preferred dietary fat. So these diets were studied in that famous 7-country study, which found that the type of fat affects cardiovascular health more than total fat. In fact, the Mediterranean diet averages about 40% fat, which is higher than the American diet, which is 35% fat. But the Mediterranean diet is mostly unsaturated fats, and American diets are about 15% saturated. So we definitely have a lot more saturated fat in our diet than the Mediterranean diets do. Mediterranean diets are also pretty high in carb, so we can't blame carbs for our obesity and our health problems. They're also high in fiber and have very few processed foods, and they only have about 20% protein in them. And are there any health benefits? Well, yes, the research really backs this up. If you turn on the news or you check PubMed, you can find endless studies that are linking the Mediterranean diet to lower stroke risk, lower risk for type 2 diabetes, lower risk for certain cancers, lower risk for heart attack, lower risk for hypertension, as well as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, too. And that leads us back to olive oil, which is the backbone to the Mediterranean diet. I have a friend from grad school by the name of Francesco Bizzioli. He's a professor of human nutrition at the University of Padua in Italy, and he runs the Olive Wellness Institute. Recently, he gave a lecture on olive oil, and some of the things in here I think worth repeating. So the first thing he says is that he really wants to emphasize the importance of extra virgin olive oil, which is the term used to describe that first press. The monounsaturated fat content doesn't change on subsequent presses. However, the important phytochemical and antioxidant properties are greatly reduced with each subsequent press. You also want to be sure you purchase the oil in a dark container that can protect it from light. And he also recommends buying in small batches because age can degrade the quality of the antioxidants, mostly over the course of a year. But overall, color really doesn't matter. Most imported olive oil comes from Spain, where they put this kind of green color in, but this doesn't indicate anything beneficial for the oil itself. And where you get your olive oil matters too. So if the olive oil is imported, it probably traveled on a boat for several weeks in fluctuating temperatures before it was bottled here in the US. And this means that while olive oil in Italy is good for Italians, it may not have the same health benefits by the time it reaches the US. This changes all the time, but the UC Davis campus does a continuing research project on olive oil at the UC Davis Olive Center. They have a website. You can go on there and you can actually find the polyphenol content and omega-3 content of many brands of olive oils to find out which ones are the more potent ones. However, what is probably the most important indicator of a good olive oil, and that's going to promote better health, is coughing. So if you take a small amount of olive oil into a cup and you drink it, and it makes you cough, you know that this olive oil has a high amount of polyphenols, which are these phytochemicals that offer some health benefits. And Dr. Bizzioli mentioned that although olive oil has less than the preferred omega-6 to omega-3 profile compared to canola oil, like I mentioned earlier, the research seems to indicate that more health benefits to olive oil are due to these polyphenols that make you cough, and those are lacking in canola oil. So if you're interested, here are some guidelines for following a Mediterranean diet. You want to aim for plentiful portions of fruits and vegetables. And I do recommend replacing, not adding. So if you're telling me that you have some hummus and you eat hummus every day with pita chips, I'm going to say, ooh, let's substitute some carrots and bell peppers for those pita chips. That way you're getting more fruits and vegetables in. Look at your plate and have half your plate be full of vegetables. Doesn't have to be the same vegetable. Maybe have a portion of it be a raw vegetable, a portion of it be a cooked vegetable, have two different types of vegetables. Try eating fruits for snack. Or take a handful of nuts, choosing whole grains most of the time. But be aware that even Italians eat white flour pastas. Choosing fish and seafood a few times a week and using lean poultry or beans and lentils on other days. And of course, you want to be sure that you're getting lots and lots of liquid oil like extra virgin olive oil. Some other recommended foods. If you aren't allergic to fish, it is recommended to try and have at least 2 servings of fish a week. Fatty fish in particular, like salmon, tuna, are good. They're fantastic sources of omega-3 fats, by the way. Whitefish and shellfish and mollusks are still good choices to have because they're low in saturated fat. Nuts are a good source for healthful oils like walnuts, almonds, sunflower seeds, pistachios, you name it. I just listed a few here, but any kind of nut is going to be fine. Just be careful with nuts on how much you eat. I do recommend no more than an ounce a day, which is about a handful. And with your oils, be sure that you're getting a variety in your oils. The Mediterranean diets are really heavy on olive oil, But if you can't acquire one that has that good polyphenol content that makes you cough, you can get some avocado oil for higher heat cooking and canola oil for baking, and then using olive oil for most of your everyday cooking. Another easy way to get more polyphenols in your diet is to eat more fruits and vegetables. Fruit makes a great dessert, and you can use fresh fruit instead of jams and jellies on your morning toast or to sweeten some plain yogurt. Vegetables are also really great for breakfast too. And the leafy green ones like spinach and arugula and lettuce can be eaten raw, or I like to mix them into pasta and rice dishes. Cruciferous vegetables have that sulfur-containing compound that, yes, gives you and these cooked vegetables a less than desirable odor. However, that sulfur-containing component is the potent cancer-fighting property of these vegetables, and having half a cup a day has been shown to be beneficial. Put some color in your diet with squashes and peppers, tomatoes, and eggplants. And the blue zone is really heavy on pulses, beans, and lentils, and they are suggested for daily consumption. Low-fat dairy products like Greek yogurt and feta and fresh mozzarella, cheeses are good options. And I always like to point out that this is not a diet that's owned by any one person or company. So you can find many free, excellent sources. And I like using Old Ways. Their website's fantastic for people who are looking for resources and recipes on how to follow this diet. Just some closing tips here. You really want to try and limit butter and lard and have those selections of olive oil, avocado oil, nut oils. When we found out that margarines were bad, a lot of people went back, Americans went back to eating butter. I don't think that was the best solution. I think that choosing some of these liquid oils is really the way to go. Reserve sweets and meats for once a week. There really a lot of evidence that the saturated fats that you're getting from meat is the worser component here for your diet health. Sweets tend to have a lot of saturated fat too because of butter content. So you really want to cut back on those. And people always ask me about alcohol, and the Mediterranean diet does include mostly red wine, but it is in moderation. It's 5 ounces a day for women, 10 ounces a day for men. That's 1 glass or 2 glasses for men, and you really don't want to exceed that. Do I have any other thoughts? Well, in a general sense, I think we need to go back to enjoying eating and work on having a good relationship with our food. It's also important to point out that in a lot of areas of the world, food is a social activity and is done at a real leisurely pace. And they have something going on there because when you eat slower, you give more time for these hunger hormones to kick in, and then we don't overconsume. You can really feel better about yourself by making some real sensible choices. And I think for a lot of people, that 80-20 rule, where you follow what you need 80% of the day and 20% you allow to stray from it, works. If you want to choose habits that's going to stick with you for the long term, remember it's a diet. It's not a diet, it's a lifestyle. And those lifestyle habits take longer to see the benefits, but they're the ones that are proven to really help you for your future health. And if you do make a bad choice, just don't let it ruin your day. Just like if you get a flat tire, you don't let the air out of the other three. You just change the tire and move on. And that's all I've got for you tonight. Thank you for listening. It's been my pleasure spending the evening with you.
Thank you so much, Kelly. We have many questions in the Q&A. I'm not sure if we have enough time to answer all of them. We have about 6 minutes. We'll try the best we could. The first question we have is, are mixed nuts okay for someone with gallbladder disease who is on a low-fat diet?
Gallbladder disease, where they go and they remove your gallbladder, is probably what they're referring to. The gallbladder just stores bile, and it doesn't mean you're never going to have bile again, but there is kind of a learning curve that our bodies have to go through. Most of the surgeons now are saying that you don't need to be on a low-fat diet even immediately after surgery, but it's very individualized. I do kind of see people may need about a month to adjust and the fat in their diet because it takes a little longer for their common bile duct to call for that fat to come. But nuts should be fine. Just start with a really small serving. and then just kind of go low fat for a few hours afterward, just to see what your body's response is to those nuts.
Okay, thank you. Is ghee a good fat?
Oh, that's a really great question. So ghee is butter. And when you look at the population that uses ghee, it's South America, it's South Asians and India. And they have a mostly vegetarian diet. And so it's confounding because they have a high incidence of like diabetes and heart disease, but they eat a lot of ghee. So ghee, I would classify again with like coconut oil and butters and animal fats. Unfortunately, it's just the saturated fat that tends to lead to more of these problems.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Um, if someone is nervous about getting a A1C test, is it possible to use a detox to lower the A1C level temporarily? I've been walking at a fast pace and sweating a lot. How effective is a detox in influencing the A1C test results? Is there a way to trick the A1C test? Is it possible to do a full detox beforehand?
I'm glad we mentioned food detox because I hope we're not talking about a colonic. Colonics are very bad for your colon health, by the way. But you know that it's the A1C, if you picture like your red blood cells and sugar in your blood is just, it's going to stick to the red blood cells. And the red blood cells are born and die every 180 days. So it's not possible to trick it. The only way that it would be influenced is if you had, unfortunately, like lost large amounts of blood or received a transfusion. Neither would I, which I recommend if you're trying to get your A1C checked, because you really do want to know. I think that's a whole other conversation for another day, Lori, but
Yeah.
I want to take away that stigma that
Mhm.
when we have a high A1C that we've done something wrong. A lot of diabetes is hereditary, and we do want to try and treat it because not treating it is going to lead to worse problems.
Mm, got it. How much fat would be good to take with D? 1000 IU. Say half the teaspoon of olive oil or 1 teaspoon.
Oh, I hope people take it with food. I wasn't thinking they would like drink the olive oil. Um, I just mentioned because I think a lot of people skip breakfast, and I know a lot of people who just like to take their vitamins first thing in the morning. Well, these fat soluble vitamins are going to be better absorbed with fat in their diet. So, you know, if you're going to have your dinner, which I got mine over here waiting for me, it's got some fat in there. And so any kind of a little amount of fat is going to be fine to help absorb those A, D, E, and Ks. It's not necessarily an amount, but just that it's present.
Which omega number is the best? Is any of them bad? Omega 3 or 6, which one is the best? It's any one of them bad.
Well, omega-6 fatty acids, they lead into a pathway that develops something called arachidonic acid, which is a pro-inflammatory pathway in our bodies. So you hear a lot how people are trying to push away like seed oils and oils that are high in omega-6 because they kind of put us into this pro-inflammatory state. And to some degree, that is true. Like I mentioned, we have 26 times the amount of omega-6 to omega-3 fats in the American diet, and only like a fraction of that, 2 to 4, is what's recommended by the experts. But they did a study where they gave people omega-6 fats and then measured arachidonic acid and all these inflammatory parameters. And they didn't actually see an increase in these inflammatory parameters. So it just goes to show how whole foods and theories don't always line up. Um, my recommendation, again, is just choose a variety of oils. Look for ones that you're going to use more like olive oil, since you have a lot of research on that one. A canola oil is another, is one actually lower in that omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. Avocado oil is another good choice, and any kind of oil that you would want to use. And staying away from processed foods that really concerns you because they're going to be the ones that are using a lot of those omega-6 varieties.
Got it. Thank you so much. It's 7 o'clock.
Oh
I
no.
want to respect everybody's time. Is it possible to answer a few more questions? Maybe 3 questions?
Yeah, let's go ahead. Let's do it.
Okay, we'll just do 3 more. Okay. Which oil would you recommend for daily cooking use?
I like olive oil. I have a couple of different types of olive oil. I really do recommend you find a place where you can go and like drink the olive oil so you can see if you get a cough with them. I don't buy the Costco oil anymore because Francesco had told us don't buy in large bulk, and it kind of hurts my budget a little bit. But if if we're using olive oil in the way that we're supposed to, we should be going through it pretty quickly. So think about that too. It's about a year, is what I think he told us. So I have olive oil, I have avocado oil when I do some high heat cooking. I'm Cajun, so I like to make a roux when I'm making gumbo, and I find that avocado oil is really fantastic because I can get that roux cooked up really good without having to worry about smoking too much. Um, and then I do still have some butter for whenever I have bread, and I have it in my little butter bell that I keep on the counter. But I use that very, very sparingly.
Okay. This next question is very similar. I think you answered that during the presentation. It's avocado oil better than canola oil when cooking in high temperature?
Only in high temperature. The profile for avocado and olive oil are almost exactly the
Oh,
same. Um, Canola oil is still gets superior on that omega-6 to omega-3 profile, but it's the olive oil that has those polyphenols and the avocado oil that has the high heat. Again, just making sure you have a variety in your diet.
okay. Thank you. So last question. Um, is that as long as 10% of fat is okay, or adding all snacks eaten that day adds up to 10%?
So 10% of your total calories should be less than 10% of your total calories should be from saturated fat. And that's a recommendation for the dietary guidelines for Americans. And we are getting about 15% on average. So we are a little higher than that. Um, so if you look at foods that have a packaging label, look for ones that do have less than 10%. Not everything has a package, not everything has a label. With those, you might have to be sure that you're, again, staying away from the animal meats, the coconut oil, the palm oil, those types of foods, so that you know that you're not getting a lot of saturated fat.
Got it. Thank you so much. I'm sorry that we didn't have enough time to answer the audience question, all of the audience question. The Liberians, we are not nutritionists, but we can find information for you from credible source. So I just put in the chat. Oh, actually, I just sent it to one of you. I just put in the chat our department's email address. You're welcome to send us an email, ask us your question. We'll try to find information for you from credible source. So with that, I want to thank Callie for such a wonderful, insightful session on the role of fats in our diet. I truly appreciate the valuable knowledge you have shared. I also want to thank everyone for joining us today. I hope you all find the session both useful and inspiring. I will be sending out an evaluation survey along with Callie's presentation slides and a link to today's recording. Your feedback is very important to us, so please take a moment to share your thoughts to help us improve future programs. Thanks once again, everyone. Wishing you all a wonderful rest of your day. Bye bye now.
Thank you so much.